any little kid can tell you that the president doesn't set tariffs that is, exclusively reserved to the Congress. But the other thing he said, and it was really, I thought, moving and distressing, is that this falls heaviest on small businesses, right? That if you are a huge company, you can absorb the tariffs and eventually pass on the cost to consumers. You can't do that. You can't plan if you don't know what you're going to be paying next year. And it was
Hmm.
interesting to hear him. He's also a lawyer. Interesting to hear him say that which is should be obvious to anybody who wants stability in the economy, which is you can't muddy the waters and have everybody just hope that because you're the president and you say you're getting good deals someday, that we all just live with it.
Welcome once again to the Oath and the Office podcast. I am John Fugelsang, so humbled and honored to be here, joined by one of my favorite people, the Ivy League professor, the author of The Oath and the Office, the great Professor Corey Brettschneider. Corey, I gotta be honest, I wasn't really ready when we started doing this for how colossally popular this podcast would become. I feel like we need to I don't know, have like a stretch limo and some coke and escorts every time we meet up because I just like it's you're the Mac, sir. The response has been so great. Congratulations.
Thanks, and thanks to you, John. I think, frankly, it's the dynamic that people want these in-depth discussions. We had this amazing discussion with Congressman Ted Lieu last week, of course, and that was amazing. We're hearing from listeners about that. What I will say about it is it's not the normal thing that you would get on, what's your response to the shutdown? What's your response to that? The normal kind of interview. We're talking about the structure of our democracy, the threat to it, the ongoing self-coup. And so what was so important about that is you heard Congressman Lieu talk about reclaiming our Constitution, that we've done it before in the period after Nixon, and that he wants to take the lead in doing it again, and he already is crafting legislation to rein in presidential power. And it also, I think this podcast, although of course we're critical of Trump, it isn't just the normal politics as usual. It isn't just partisan bickering. We're talking about how to preserve our democracy in the face of a threat to it. And so the fact that he talked about the need to do that in a democratic presidency, I thought that was insightful because that is often how we've done it. The Ethics in Government Act, which created a real check on all presidents, Democratic and Republican, was signed during the Carter presidency. And when he
That's
was
right.
subjected to investigation for his chief of staff, Hamilton Jordan was involved with drug use, I think, accused of drug use at Studio 54, of all places. In that moment, you didn't hear him say, no, Studio 54 has no drugs. He said, yeah, investigate it. I don't care if it's somebody close to me. That's how the law works. Nobody is
Right.
above it. And this was an inspirational interview. I urge people to go back and listen to it because it helps us, not just for the past, but looking to the future, think about how we recover our democracy. And as much as the theme of this podcast is about the destruction of our democracy right now, it is also about how we can have hope that we'll recover it in the future.
Well, let me ask you about that because Axios is reporting that this administration has been scouring social media for posts that are critical of the government, which we've known they're thin-skinned, they're vicious, they're deeply insecure, but now unions are suing, saying that this going through social media to find, free speech critiques is a direct attack on the First Amendment. Corey, how does this fit into your understanding that free speech is not about citizenship, but about personhood?
Well, I just think one of the most tragic moments that we're facing right now is the ability to say that. Sorry, I'll just say this again. I think one of the most tragic and dangerous things that we're facing right now is this administration's contention, not just in the media, not just for political gain, but in court, that the United States Constitution, in its protection of free speech, is only a right of citizens. And that when it comes to non citizens, they have the right to just expel or keep out critics. And that's what they're saying again and again. And In court, we've seen in the case of a student at Columbia University, an activist, some pushing back and a victory actually in a district court in Louisiana. And now we're seeing also the case of this union fighting back and
That's
saying
right.
when the administration scours social media looking for critics of non-citizen critics of our administration, we're going to kick them out. No, I don't think so. And let me just say what the Constitution says. It says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. It talks, and what that means is the government, the federal government, including the president. Congress is a stand-in for the federal government there, and it doesn't talk about the rights of citizens. So this is really a battle. I mean, more desperately, they're talking about the future mayor of New York, the likely future mayor of New York,
Of
stripping his
course.
citizenship because of his disloyalty.
Yep.
And this division between citizens and not recognizing that our Constitution protects people, persons, as we're supposed to
Correct.
do,
Correct. Human
is really
beings.
a
The,
disaster.
the
Human
the
beings.
Constitution is a limitation on government power, not a limitation
Yes.
on human rights. But what does it mean when the government is using surveillance to chill dissent, including against organized labor? I mean, my God, this is the kind of authoritarian power the First Amendment was written to prevent. These people are so stupid, Corey.
I mean, this case comes out of NASA, and they're going to make all sorts of claims in court. National security is different. Well, that's not really the workers that are at issue in this case are not involved in national security, and they're calling this out for what it is, a attack in all sorts of ways on the First Amendment. What's interesting about this lawsuit too is it talks about a basic fact, which is how are you able to organize? To use your rights to unionization, to collective bargaining, to fight back if you're frightened of being deported. And the thing about the First Amendment that this brings out is that the First Amendment isn't just some discrete small right of, I want to say what I think. No, it is the fundamental right in democracy. It makes voting possible. It makes proposing, deciding about public policy possible. It makes organizing possible. And so this isn't just a one-off, discrete right that we could say, oh, that one's not a big deal. It is our democracy. And when we talk about threats to democracy, it's why we're focused so much on the First Amendment right of free speech. And I
Absolutely.
will say one other thing too, John, is that there's a lot of discussion now. Ezra Klein had a very interesting empirical analysis of the Democratic Party, which is showing that increasingly working class people are gravitating towards Republicans, despite the long history of working class people and unions being
Oh,
associated
yeah.
with the Democratic Party. But this union saying, hey, we are sticking up for the First Amendment shows it's just a lie to think that there's a difference between pocketbook issues and civil liberties. We talked last week with Congressman Liu, for instance, about tariffs. And I was trying to make the point that, look, inflation is a result of the tariffs, which is a result of the destruction of Congress's rightful power. And I'll say that here too, that if you care about organizing, you better care about the First Amendment. You
Amen.
better care about free speech. And the Democratic Party, I think, should start tying these things together, unionizing, collective bargaining, economic pocketbook issues are constitutional issues. We saw that so brilliantly from the Attorney General Raul Torres of New Mexico. That was one of our older
That's
discussions,
right.
but it really sticks with me because he's one of the people trying to pioneer how you think about these issues together.
I mean, I also want to remind everyone that, as Heather McGhee documented so beautifully in her book, The Sum of Us, racism is how they broke up the unions.
Right.
We know the divide and conquer mechanism. When I hear working class people drifting to the party of billionaires, we know how they've always done it. They've always done it by demonizing brown people who are coming here to take something away from you. That's how they broke up organized labor. You want that guy on the line, that black guy, to be paid the same thing as you? I mean, Heather McGhee did it much better than me, but this is traditionally part of the divide and conquer mechanism. But one more question on this, and then I want to
Yeah.
move on to I want to move on
Can
to
I just
guns,
say, John, that
guns and
it's
weed. But okay, go ahead, please.
I just think it's such an important point because what we're talking about right now is how you craft a strategy that combines the constitutional issues that we're talking about with the pocketbook issues. And the idea that you could simultaneously allow for the erosion of civil rights, which this administration is trying to do, not just to destroy civil liberties, but basic rights to not be discriminated against, and also be for the power of citizens to organize, workers to organize, and to collective bargaining. It's not possible. Rights and workers' rights go hand in hand, and civil liberties, I'll add, especially the right to free speech, is part of that.
Mm, absolutely. Although I wouldn't say they're letting civil rights die by erosion. It's more like a
No.
garroting and then bury them in a lead
Yeah,
box.
all out
Uh,
assault.
let's talk about guns and weed, Corey. I've been waiting all day. The Supreme Court just heard arguments on whether people who use legal cannabis can be barred from owning guns. Not people who use prescription meds, not people on Oxy, not alcoholics, people who use legal cannabis. Maybe the one demographic we most want to have guns, the stoned people who are not the ones causing fights at the discotheques and the sporting events. This case is going to pit Second Amendment fervor against the federal government's own very contradictory drug laws. There's so much to unpack here. I know the NRA is going to have a lot of feelings about this, but once again, we find occasionally, yeah, they're all for limiting the rights of citizens to arm themselves. I mean, we've seen it happen with stop and frisk. If they find the right person they want to pick on, they don't care about the Second Amendment so much anymore. So, what constitutional tensions does this expose, and does this have any chance of ever passing? It seems really stupid.
Well, look, I'll say what the issue is. The question is whether or not the Second Amendment, which, although it is really about militias, a sort of ancient and no longer relevant idea, the Second Amendment should be a dead letter, and it was for a long time. But in the Heller case, Justice Scalia succeeded in reviving it as an individual right. Now, over time, the court has moved from the way Scalia thought about it, which was in terms of the text of the First Amendment, that's how he made his argument, to a different kind of originalism that says, look, if there's a limit on the First Amendment that's constitutional, you've got to show that there was an equivalent kind of limit, anyway, in the 18th century when the Second Amendment was ratified as
Mm-hmm.
part of the Bill of Rights. So now, to my mind, it's just obvious that some restrictions on the Second Amendment, after all, the Second Amendment talks about regulation. Well-regulated militia is how it starts.
Right?
Regulation is part of it. So on the one hand, I want to say, like, of course they could have limits. It's not a violation of the Second Amendment to bar convicted felons, for instance. And yes, I think that it's sensible too to have limitations in all sorts of ways. But the problem is the selectivity of going at, why are they going after medical marijuana users? And I think here you can't
Or
think.
recreational, legal recreational.
Yeah, it's not, this isn't a constitutional principle. I think, we have to think of it in terms of the non-principled coup that Trump wants to go after his opponents. And I think, this administration views people who use medical or recreational marijuana as hippies, as their opponents.
Yeah.
It's that simple. So constitutionally, I think the best thing to do is to say, yes, they're really, I'm for anything that erodes the absolutism of the Second Amendment, but at the same time, I want to recognize the weirdness of this case, which is that it is just part of the attempt to attack opponents. And the reason why the administration is taking a stand against the Second Amendment expansion, against the NRA, is because they want to attack opponents. It's a weird case that can only be understood in this unprincipled way with this administration. Now, what should the court say? It should limit the Second Amendment. It shouldn't have
Thank
any
you.
protection for it. But let's also call out what's going on here, which is an attack on opponents. And if we could use this, if this is a moment where the court does limit the Second Amendment, Justice Thomas had an opinion in the Rahimi case, in which it just looked like there was going to be no limits. Like even keeping a nuclear weapon in your backyard would have been protected under the Second Amendment. They're finally pushing back against this. This might be part of that trend. But at the same time, I'm trying to be careful and say, there's nothing in the Trump administration that's principled here.
No.
Does
Why,
that
why,
make
why
sense?
start
Or was
now?
that a
Yeah,
rant?
yeah, yeah. But like, all right. So the DOJ is defending the restrictions, and which feels odd to me again because
Yeah,
we know how deeply right-wing politics fetishize the Second Amendment. So,
right.
like, is this? This seems like it's just another example of the movement using constitutional freedom quite selectively to serve an ideology, but not to serve a principle. I mean, is this case a larger pattern where
Yeah.
rights are interpreted hierarchically, gun rights first, civil rights last?
I think that's giving them even too much credit. I mean, the
Oh,
ideology, I'd say that it serves. And that might be the first time you've given them too much credit. Usually I'm giving
I was going to say, yeah.
I think the ideology that it's serving, to go to your main point, is Trumpism. And Trumpism is about us versus them. And the marijuana users are them, and us is not them. Let's not forget either that this is the law that was used to convict Hunter Biden. And to the
That's right.
extent that, Hunter Biden's been pardoned, so not a lot for him hinges on this. But if it turns out that, this law is unconstitutional that was used to convict Hunter Biden, that might revive the idea that somehow he did nothing wrong. And they don't want that. So maybe they're still litigating in a weird way this Hunter Biden criminal conviction. That could be part of the psychology. But I do think the simplest explanation is they don't like drugs and they don't like people who use
Mm,
drugs because they think that they're their opponents. Now, when, there's a difference, of
oh
course, between hard
no.
drugs and medical marijuana, but I
Yeah.
think they think these are hippies, and we don't like the hippies. So there is no principle here. It's that, friend enemy. That's really
Yeah. So
their way.
it's not just anti-civil liberties, it's not just anti-freedom,
Right.
it's anti-capitalist as well. I mean, this is legal cannabis. This is a business now. You've got all kinds of right-wing douchebags getting all into the cannabis game now that they can make a profit off of it. So I think we need to mention this is anti-freedom, it's anti-liberty, it's anti-business.
Yeah. I think when we talk about politics, I'm all for it. The podcast has this ideal, the oath in the office. It's about principle. We often are breaking down the principles and trying to understand conservative ideas. I mean, maybe we could do a better job of trying to build them up. But when we're trying to understand Trumpism, there are no ideas. It's just, what I want, what my people want, and the enemies have to be silenced. And I think that's how you understand this, that it's a way of restricting the rights of his enemies. And it has nothing to do with the Second Amendment or the Constitution because he doesn't think that way. He thinks about people I like and people I hate. As he said, I hate my enemies. I don't understand how others don't hate their enemies. I hate my enemies. He was talking about Charlie Kirk, didn't hate
That's
his
right.
enemies.
Yeah, well, we got to take a quick break, but when we come back, it's Handmaid's Tale time. America's favorite sister wife, Amy Coney Barrett, has been doing the interview circuit. We'll be back in just a moment with The Oath and the Office. Welcome back to The Oath and the Office. I'm John Fugelsang, joined by Professor Corey Brettschneider. Corey, it's time to talk about something that should scare the hell out of anyone who still believes in democracy. Supreme Court Justice Amy Coney Barrett just told the New York Times that if Donald Trump defies the court, there's basically nothing they can do about it. The woman who sits on the highest court in the land just admitted the court is powerless if the president decides to ignore it and blow them off. No purse, no sword, no spine. But Corey, Justice Amy Coney Barrett said that she's unsure whether the court has an obligation to protect the judicial branch from attacks by a president. Should the Supreme Court see itself as the guardian of judicial independence? I mean, what does it mean if these justices start treating presidential intimidation as acceptable or inevitable or meh? I mean, it's terrifying how she's playing dumb and rolling over for this guy.
Well, I think that what you're bringing up was one of the most concerning parts of the CBS interview, and I'll just lay it out a little bit what she said. But to remind listeners, we talked about this in the CASA case about birthright citizenship. The court, for the first time, took away the power of the district courts to impose universal injunctions. And what this was a tool that, to my mind, goes back to the founding. And it simply says, look, if something's unconstitutional in my little part of the country, it's unconstitutional, period, and we better stop it. And the Supreme Court in the birthright citizenship case, which really illustrates the point, because if it's not just one person's birthright citizenship entitlement that's being threatened by Trump's
That's right.
executive order revoking it, it's the entire country's. So there had been a district court national injunction, multiple actually, stopping this executive order. And for the first time in American history, the Supreme Court of the United States came along and said, we don't think this long-standing procedure is appropriate. We're going to get rid of these universal injunctions that allowed birthright citizenship to be revoked through executive order throughout the country as this case works its way through the courts, and they still haven't taken it. Now, she defended that by saying, look, there's a law that limits The Judiciary Act, an 18th century Judiciary Act, limits these universal injunctions. And what she was failing to see as she tried to give answers, and I couldn't, it was a word salad. I couldn't really get what the answer was.
Uh-huh.
But that the real threat to democracy, I think, when it comes down to, she thinks is courts and judicial imperialism, not the president, the most powerful branch. And here she really got into it. And she was asked with Justice Jackson, who said, the threat here isn't from the courts, they're enforcing the law. It's from a president that wants to be a dictator. Again and again in the interview, she refused to acknowledge that this is anything unique that we're facing. She said, look, I'm concerned about the next president or the president after that or past
Yeah.
presidents. I don't think about this president. What if this president is the president forever? What if he destroys democracy?
Honestly, you're
No
right, man.
understanding of any of this. And this idea really, and this is what was sad, at the same time she says, we're not a political branch. She's parroting the talking points of the idea of a judicial coup. And, I found that really worrying.
Look, if I had Kavanaugh and Clarence Thomas and Alito around to make me look more likable, I take advantage of it as well. But I'm hung up on this one, Professor. I mean, she suggested the court's job is to interpret the Constitution and make the most with the tools we have, which sounds to me like she is very publicly lowering expectations for what the court should do in checking authoritarian behavior. If the court admits it won't enforce its own rulings, and Congress is either gridlocked or complicit, are we not witnessing a collapse of the constitutional checks and balances the founders designed? Where does that leave the American people?
Yeah, the interview and her statements generally left me with a combination of feelings. One is there's an element of condescension when you say repeatedly these cliches of I'm just enforcing the law. There's a disagreement about what the law is, so you have to defend it. And claiming that it's somehow not political or there are no value judgments, while at the same time you're flirting with this idea of common law constitutionalism. I found all of that really both condescending and yet at the same time deeply worrying because the job of the court is very clear. It's to enforce the law, especially against a president who would threaten to destroy it. And when she was asked, for instance, by CBS about Trump's statements about whether or not he could have a third term, she, in her book, my understanding is very clear. No, you can have two terms. And that's what the interviewer brought out. But then when she was asked about it, even there she backed out and she just referred to the amendment in the abstract that limits a president to two terms. But she left
Yeah.
open the possibility that she wasn't going to say the obvious thing, which is no, he can't do that. And she also missed the obvious fact that when you have a president threatening to stay in power, especially January 6th, the attempt to stay in power illegally, that this isn't a normal situation. So it's somebody who frankly struck me as having her head in the sand. Now, I have an amicus brief. I think actually when listeners are listening to this, the tariffs case is going to be argued. And I try to be, critical of the justices' opinions and not them personally. But it was very hard for me to watch this interview and to not come to the conclusion that this isn't somebody who really is understanding what needs to be done to uphold the rule of law.
I mean, yeah, I don't think they care. I think they have careers and they're doing just fine and they're well compensated. And if you're Clarence Thomas, remember when we were all shocked at how much he was taking bribes a year ago and it's just forgotten now? I mean,
Seems
the
important.
bribes, the bribes are legal. The bribes are public. There's no accountability. And I hear Amy Coney Barrett and this combination of originalism and the unitary executive theory and the common good constitutionalism and the president can't be held accountable for crimes he commits. And I'm seeing a constitutional theocracy, a system where presidential power and right wing, narrow religious ideology are inherently going to override any kind of democratic checks. That's
Well,
where we're at.
when you look at the intellectual roots of common law constitutionalism, something we continue to discuss, but I have mentioned the theorist that in many ways is the origin story for this idea, and that's the Nazi theorist Carl Schmitt, who really did believe in a kind of theocracy, a kind of dictatorship in which the leader had access, I suppose, to the common good, but what in
Yeah.
reality it meant is that the constraints of democracy were no longer there. Now, the Adrian Vermeule I've mentioned does have a book called called The Constitution Unbound, And in that book, he talks about Carl Schmitt as his intellectual hero, and that worries me. I mean, to have think about the danger that this idea of dictatorship poses to the democracy that we're in, the way that Weimar Germany, a parliamentary democracy that Schmitt had criticized, collapsed into something quite different. Uh, I'm not going to hide from it. That's what I'm worried about at this moment.
All right, we got to take a quick break. We'll be right back with more. This is The Oath and the Office.
Oh, actually, one of two returning guests. Listeners loved our discussion with her so much, they've asked that we bring her back, and I loved it as well. And it's, of course, Dahlia Lithwick. Dahlia is one of the country's leading legal journalists. She's the longtime host of the wonderful podcast that I've been honored to be on, Amicus. And she's senior editor at Slate. And I'll also mention her great book, and you can listen to our past episode where we talked about it in depth, Lady Justice, Women, the Law, and the Battle to Save America. Dahlia Lithwick, welcome back to The Oath in the Office. It's really a pleasure to have you here.
It's always a treat to talk with you, Corey. Thank you for having me back.
So great. It is great to have you back. Unfortunately, the topics, of course, that we're going to talk about are worrying rather than great. And I just wanted to jump right in. The last time we spoke to our listeners about what's happening in Portland and the deployment of the military, a three-judge panel had stopped the deployment. Sorry, I'm going to say that again. The last time we spoke to listeners, a three-judge panel from the Ninth Circuit had greenlit the deployment of the military to Portland, but there's an update in that case. So I'll just begin by asking you what happened, and of course it had to do possibly, or what was involved was some misleading information from the Trump lawyers. So give us an update.
I mean, the update is essentially the thing that almost never happens, Corey, which is that the Justice Department says, holy cow, we misled the court. We fudged the numbers. And it was a non-inconsequential fudge where they represented that far more employees were being surged into Portland, so much so that, they couldn't do their jobs. And the numbers were just way off. And part of the reason it's interesting is because the dissenting judge on the three-judge panel of the Ninth Circuit that heard this case, at the time when she was kind of on the losing end of it, was like, these numbers feel really hinky to me. I don't know that they're representing this correctly. And she got spanked for it, by the way, by the other two in the majority. And it turned out that the DOJ had to come back and say, yeah, no, we were wrong. The math didn't math. And it's appalling. And it's part of... we're in this crazy, I mean, as you and I are taping, there's literally a hearing going on in DC for Sandwich Guy, right? The guy who threw a sandwich at an officer. And it's cartoonish because literally the testimony, which everybody in law land is gobsmacked. I know it's trivial next to the real existential legal problems, but it's literally like he's being the guard is being cross-examined on like, oh, he could feel the sandwich hit him through his bulletproof vest and it exploded. The sandwich detonated, and then they show like footage of the still wrapped sandwich on the ground, and the guy's like, oh, well, some of the stuff is oozing out. Like, it's crazy. And the only reason it's sort of important is that this lying, this sort of perpetual lying that we're seeing almost never gets caught. And when it gets caught and you have a court that has to be like, yeah, no, they lied to us, the aggregate harm to the Justice Department cannot be overstated. It is so bad for the Justice Department.
And I want to ask you more about what this says about the general disregard of the truth by this Justice Department, disregard of the law. But I guess I wanted to just dive in a little bit deeper here. I mean, one of the dynamics that we talked about on the podcast last time, and that's certainly relevant to what we're talking about now, is the argument of the Department of Justice and as I understand it, the two judges who gave the green light in the three-judge panel to the deployment, is that really we're not supposed to second guess the president. So the president, of course, in this case, is saying that the reason for the deployment is the protection of the federal building here, and don't second guess me. Now, I guess I wanted to ask you how this fact of the blatant lying, what it says about that idea of deference to the president.
Right. I mean, there's sort of two layers to it. One is, and it goes to this structural argument about how the Justice Department has to operate. And there is this thing called the presumption of regularity. And it's just a long-standing presumption that courts give DOJ lawyers. Why? Because they come in hundreds of times on hundreds of cases. And if every single time we start from the presumption that the Justice Department is lying, then they don't get anything done, right? Every single case is appealed. And so, right or wrong, like stipulated, the Justice Department doesn't always get it right. But there are efficiencies in presuming that when the government represents something to you, particularly when they are repeat players, right? The same folks who are getting up and saying the government represents, courts tend to treat that as though it's essentially truthful. And by the way, the sort of sidebar there is that it is one of the reasons when the Justice Department screws up, they're so quick to correct things, right? Because you don't want to mess with that presumption. It does massive violence to the Justice Department's ability to function. And Ryan Goodman at NYU just came out with this staggering report of how many dozen judges have now said to Justice Department lawyers, I think you're lying. I think you're not telling the truth. You've squandered in 10 months years and years of capital built up. So that's a piece of it, right? How does the Justice Department operate when judges are starting to say, you're lying and also you didn't correct the record? The larger thing, and I think it's the thing you're flicking at, and it's so important, is that there has been, particularly when the president says this is an emergency, a presumption that judges are not experts, right? On national policy, on military law, right? So there is a strong presumption, and Brett Kavanaugh likes to say this in opinions, that when there is some exigent, particularly foreign policy, I know we're going to talk about that in the tariffs context, but that we don't second guess. And it's part of this larger sort of unitary executive theory, right? The president is the head of all things. But with it, there is this corresponding sense that we are not going to raise questions. And so what you're saying, and I think it's the thing that has shifted, is that the majority judges in that Portland case, but we're seeing it around the country, are grappling with this almost existential question of, I'm sorry, you're telling us that we're not allowed to scrutinize anything, not the record, not the facts, not testimony, not affidavits. Everything is off the table. When Donald Trump says the sky is orange, we have to defer to that. And there are reasons that in many serious exigent national crises, you want judges to defer. And as I say, that's a long-standing assumption. But holy hell, when you have just shot a cannon through that presumption and essentially told judges that when Donald Trump says the sky is orange, and when the Justice Department comes to you, as they did in the Portland case, and says, yeah, no, right, we totally lied and said the sky was orange, and there's no roles for judges in questioning that, now you're really, really like in Orwell territory.
Yeah, and that was such a great breakdown, that there is a presumption that the Department of Justice is telling the truth, partly for pragmatic reasons, and when they lie blatantly, not just here, but as you've said in these many other cases, we start to question whether that's right or not, and whether or not there should be a presumption. But the more troubling maybe worry here, and that is a straightforward argument that says, well, maybe we shouldn't trust the Department of Justice if they're lying. But where it gets complicated, and you brought this out so well, is when, and I think this is exactly related to the unitary executive theory, there is an idea of trusting the president more generally and deferring to his or her power. So in the travel ban case, for instance, we saw that that was part of the argument. We'll assume it's not animus in the final analysis because we'll trust the president says there's security rationales. And here, maybe we should trust the president who thinks that these buildings are under fire. I mean, the reality really strikes at the heart of that presumption. I'll shift a little bit on that second point and just say, one possibility here is that Trump won't continue to lie and say this is about protecting these buildings, but instead will shift, or federal workers, instead will shift to the Insurrection Act and to say, well, I've got this more powerful tool, and he certainly knows about it. He's been saying that in interviews. So what do you think happens in that moment? I mean, once you invoke the Insurrection Act, are they more likely to just defer to the president's sense that there really is a sort of lawlessness and to not engage in that second guessing? Is that the end game when it comes to deployment, and we might just see the courts back off?
I mean, in so many of these cases, I think of it as this galactic game of chicken, right? Between the courts and probably more essentially the US Supreme Court, because that's where the rubber meets the road, and the president, right? And so what you are seeing is this kind of weird little, I'm now going to confuse my metaphors, for which I apologize, but it's kind of a game of chicken, and it's also Zeno's paradox, right? Where they keep getting closer and closer and closer to this thing that is the nightmare scenario for the Supreme Court, which is what the so-called constitutional crisis, right? Where the Supreme Court issues an order and the president doesn't back down. And that is what I think at many levels, especially when you've got Congress who's like, like pinned under something heavy and not going to move at any time soon. That's it. That's the crisis, is that the court is trying, I think, if I'm imputing the best possible motives to the center of the court, that doesn't want, the flaming dumpster of American democracy to happen on their watch, then I think we have to really ask, like, what is the end game here for John Roberts and Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett, who I don't think are complete nihilists. And I think a lot of what we are seeing is this inching toward how do we sort of save enough whatever, social, political legitimacy capital we have at the court and not turn every single issue with Donald Trump into a constitutional crisis, right? Saving our powder for when it really matters. And I think you're exactly right. There is a strange way in which we've seen the administration in multiple cases not necessarily do the big swing thing, test the water. Let me see if I can, put people on planes to Seacott prison and, lie to the courts and say that they're all, convicted drug dealers and gang members, and see if the court calls me on it, right? And time and again, the court hasn't really, actually, that's the one exception where the court does slightly call them on it. But for the most part, we've seen this kind of, think of a toddler testing the waters, right? Now I've like eaten all the Snickers and all the Mars bars. Now I'm going to see if I can eat, all of the Tootsie Rolls. And I think there is a way in which the court thinks that it is saving its capital for the big thing, whatever the big thing is. And it may be tariffs, by the way. And in the meantime, what is the pattern that we are seeing is on crazy issues, right? Impoundment. We know that the president can't, impound funds that have been appropriated by Congress and designated, right? We know that you can't fire heads of agencies, but he does it, right? And the courts, largely on the shadow docket, right, and late at night with unsigned orders, has blessed it. And so it's a form of appeasement. And I think the question you're asking, I don't want to be too meta about it, is what wins, right? The appeasement or the president just pulling the nuclear option? And of course, the Insurrection Act is the nuclear option when it comes to, right, how do we get around posse comitatus? How do we get around, all the sand in the gears that comes up in these lower court cases when you are short of the Insurrection Act. But I think that what we are seeing in case after case after case, including these extrajudicial assassinations,
Yeah.
in the waters in the Pacific and the Caribbean, I think what you're seeing is the president inching toward the sort of mega intervention, the sort of thermonuclear thing, and the court appeasing and appeasing and appeasing and appeasing, waiting for some thing that is so profound that they have to act. And I guess if I were to bet, which is I think your question about the Insurrection Act, I think the president wins. I
Yeah,
think the person
that's my
who
worry.
is willing to be absolutely bonkers and
Yeah.
has no regard for law or, the institutions,
Yes,
I think
that's
wins
exactly
in
my
that.
worry that, I think the way they see it is exactly how you put it, that they think, okay, we've got to balance this out. This is the president. We've always deferred to the president. Barrett, for instance, says we, in the past have deferred, for instance, to Biden. We can't just think about it being this president. I think that that's certainly less true than she claimed in that interview. But at least the way they see it. And then the question is, well, on one of the huge issues, namely the Insurrection Act, the use of the military, after all, to shut down our civil liberties, are they going to push back? They might see that as part of the bargain that has to be made. Are they ever going to push back? We'll come to the tariffs case soon and talk about that. Perhaps, I hope that is the place that they will start to push back, and it's not an insignificant place to push back. But first, I did want to ask you about a place where I don't know where the checks are in this dynamic, but not conflict between branches or oversight, but one within the executive branch itself, which is, after all, so powerful, more than 2 million people in the executive branch. And of course, the Department of Justice is within the executive branch. So tell us about this shakedown, I think you've called it, of the Department of Justice, where the president wants restitution for as he falsely claims, the harassment and false accusations about in regard to the investigations of his criminal activity. So how much money is he seeking? Is he likely to get it? What's going on here? And it seems just perfect to call it a shakedown. So maybe say something about that too.
No, I mean, I think I almost want to put it in the bucket with the sandwich guy, right, Corey? Like at one level, this is cartoonish. The amount is $230 million
Wow.
from the Justice Department, based on things he's already filed in the past, right? He's not actually filing something. He's just got like a running tally of all of the federal investigations while he was in, office. And then, I'm sorry, after he was in office. So whether it's the Russia investigation or the search of Mar-a-Lago, like he's just been like had the meter running like a taxi. And he's really mad. And he thinks that the Justice Department owes him $230 million. And of course, the reason this is a cartoon is I mean, it's laughable on its own terms, but it so goes to this issue of the corruption at DOJ because the very people who would be determining, oh, we're the arbiters of whether the Justice Department owes President Trump $230 million, which almost covers the ballroom, by the way, although I gather now that's been covered, right, by captains of industry. So he says he's giving the money to charity, so it's okay. But I think that the folks who are going to be determining whether the Justice Department harassed the president to the tune of $230 million are the people who were his private lawyers, right,
Yeah.
when he was out of office, and now are all lackeys at DOJ. So I'm not laughing out of joy. I'm laughing out of how absurd this is. And it feels a little bit like, I mean, I think that he sort of walked it back. There was this deeply strange comment he gave where he was like, this would be so weird. It would be me deciding to pay myself. And so
Exactly.
even
In an
he
interview.
understands that it's ludicrous, which is where we got the charity line from. But I think that the two things that are important are everything is a grift, everything is a shakedown. This is, I've been calling this administration, the MO is protection racket, and every
Mm.
step of the way, it's just how do we squeeze money? In this case, I should have been clear, taxpayer money, right?
Yeah.
This is you and me paying for this.
Yeah.
How do we squeeze money out and then like bestow our largesse on charities and make it seem as though this is justice? And I think that's part of it that's really frightening. But it really, I think, is a story that is emblematic of who is not in the room in this 2.0
Yeah.
administration, right? Because he had lots of people
Right.
around him in the first term to say, that is unutterably insane. Please don't even float this idea.
Mm.
And there's no one there now to say bad idea. They're all like, excellent
Yeah.
idea, sir.
Yeah, and I think it fits with our other theme that there was an assumption that judges would trust, for instance, the Department of Justice to not lie, because there are lawyers who are concerned about their own integrity and would not do so and would not put the department's reputation at risk. And in the same way, in Trump 1.0, there might have been civil servants and members of the Department of Justice around who would say, even if I'm a political appointee, I don't just serve you. The Department of Justice is independent. But what I hear you saying now is, in both cases, as he replaces people who are concerned to, well, take their oath seriously and the law seriously and the truth seriously with loyalists, that the checks are largely gone. I mean, in this one, we'll talk about the tariffs case. We talked already about the question of deployment of the military. There's at least some back and forth and question about whether there's going to be a check. Is there any check here on this deal? Any hope that we could keep him from essentially stealing out of the public treasury more than $200 million?
I mean, I think that this is a bunch of kind of nuisance suits that are filed in weird places under, administrative structures. And so I think the argument is this is never going to amount to anything. That's probably the check. But I don't think there's a sort of structural check to say, this is a horrifically bad idea. Please don't shake down the American public while you're cutting SNAP benefits and while healthcare is skyrocketing. And there's one other piece I'd be curious if you agree with me, but there is a piece of this that is just vintage Steve Bannon flood the zone with shit, right? Am I allowed to swear on your show?
Yeah.
Okay, because I think that I also group this with, the whole conversation last week about is he running for a third term, right? Where like you and I are lawyerly enough to be like, oh, is this a sound legal proposition, right? Like I think both you and I think that the outer bounds of the law is where the conversation stops. And I do, I always think of this particularly after the immunity decision, right? Where the lawyerly answer to that case was, okay, well, we'll figure out what are the, the outer perimeters, right? And what is in and outside of the bounds of the Supreme Court opinion. And I think that that's at one level, look, that's what we do. I mean, that's how the law works. But I think that there is this weird like maelstrom of lawlessness that we then chase around to be like, well, that can't be legal, right? We have constitutional amendments that say you can't run for a third office. And I think I want to just posit, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think that so much of this stuff gets chummed up, as a distraction from SNAP and from, trashing the East Wing. But also, I think it's a kind of performative, the law doesn't matter. And people like you and I who think words matter, language matters, truth matters, right? This is like the gravamen of this conversation, get crazy when they say stuff like, yeah, we're just going to like sue the American people for $230 million. I think the question isn't always, is it lawful? I think the question is, what are they trying to signal to us about the rule of law? And that I worry about.
It's a great question, and it's one that we're grappling with on our podcast really every week, and I know you are too on yours. I mean, one thought I have is it might start off often that he says, okay, how can I distract from, say, the Epstein files or from the shutdown? And okay, I'll ask for this money. But it's so outrageous what he asked for. And the unfortunate truth is the checks are so few, which is part of what we're talking about, that he might get away with it. So then the distraction becomes the thing. It becomes so much worse. And then what are we to do there that if we just look away and say it's just a distraction, well, we miss the new thing that is the threat to democracy. So I think that, yes, they are flooding the zone, but all the things they're flooding it with are real threats. And that also, as we start to think about the question we're grappling with, like how can we fight back? And yes, courts should should stop this. And then we talked about in the last discussion that they really might not, that there are all sorts of ways in which he might get around it or their own balance. Even Barrett in the interview said, She had said very clearly, it sounds like at one point, that no, he can't run for a third term because there's an amendment prohibiting it. And then when she was really pressed, she was like, well, you should read the amendment. And what does that leave open? That I don't know what
Right.
it is, but as they did in birthright citizenship, which is clear in his day, that they'll come up with some magic words or some magic theory that says, some equivalent of subject to the jurisdiction, that allows a, non-consecutive terms. So that's my worry, that really all of these things start as distraction and then they become part of the real threat to democracy. I mean, I'll throw that back to you.
No, I think you're saying two really vitally important things. One is we make this category error again in this business of thinking that the law is what the Supreme Court says it is, right? And so if there are five justices who are willing to say, and they may say, birthright citizenship, although it is clear as
Yeah.
day, and has been understood to be clear as day since the amendment was passed, doesn't mean what it says it means. That
Mm.
doesn't mean the law changed. That means that this entity that we call the U.S. Supreme Court, who, for all the reasons we don't need to get into, does not necessarily represent nine people who were duly, appropriately vetted and seated on that court. That's what they decide. And I think it's really useful for listeners to just keep remembering that just because the U.S. Supreme Court determined that, you can foment an insurrection and not get tossed off the Colorado ballot doesn't mean that clause of the Constitution doesn't say exactly what it
Right.
says. It means, and by the same token, just because the majority of the Supreme Court plucked out of thin air this notion of maximalist, near boundless immunity for
Right.
presidents, including, by the way, in conferring and working with their attorneys general, which sows the seeds for all the mayhem at DOJ we see now, doesn't mean that's the law. And I think we have to be
Right.
really clear-eyed about that.
Right.
But I think that the second sort of part of it, and it's also really, really important, is that we now know the tells, right? We know when the Supreme Court is going to do something that is just objectively, indefensibly lawless. As you just said, we know the tells, right? You pull out some like half-cooked originalism in order to end Roe v. Wade, right? You pull out some completely batshit, unprecedented theory about, the major questions doctrine, which is
Right.
not a thing, right? And you use it to get rid of Biden initiatives, but not, we'll find out in the tariffs case,
Right.
Trump initiatives. So I just think like I'm trying to train my mind, and it's hard because I went to law school. This is not how I was raised,
Ah.
not to watch what the law is, but watch what the Supreme Court's tell is.
Yeah.
And once they start doing one of their little tricks, you can sort of say, oh, they're doing that at, 11 o'clock at night on the shadow docket with 3 sentences. Okay, that's a tell.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, we're looking at these things in very similar ways every week. And I should remind listeners, I did last time too, that you were a few years ahead of me at Stanford Law School. So we had a similar kind of introduction to all of this and look at things in a similar way. I don't think any of our professors could have imagined it would have seemed too wild a hypo, any of these cases. I do want to ask you before we say goodbye, this has been a great topic and we're going to continue on the theme, but about the tariffs case. Of course, you interviewed one of the litigants. You've been following it closely, and it is a moment I've been saying, as listeners know, and I have an amicus brief saying if you look at IEPA, the statute at issue, it's not only not granting power to the president, it's retracting it. And if you want to ask the question of whether or not this newly created idea that comes from this court of major question, this is pretty major question. No taxation without representation. Tariffs are a kind of tax. So all of the law points in the direction, I would think, of saying, no way is this emergency use of tariff power constitutional. But threading the conversation back to what we've been talking about, I mean, what do you think? How do you see them handling it? Is this the moment, to go back to your point from our first part of the discussion, where they've got to just say, this is too embarrassing. We can't hand over power here. We've got to push back. You are seeing in the litigation team a combination of more progressives like Neil Katyal and then Judge McConnell, for instance. So it's not ideologically obvious, what the answer to this is. It seems to me to be obvious in terms of the law. You had a great headline from one of your discussions about, I don't remember what the age was, but it was something to the degree of even a child could understand why this case has to be decided against Trump. So what do you think about the case? And what do you think is going to happen?
Yeah, I mean, listen, by the time this conversation drops, we'll know a
Right.
lot more, right? It's going to be heard Wednesday. It was heard Wednesday. And I think what you're surfacing are, the tensions that make this harder in some ways than birthright citizenship, than immigration, even than I would say, militarized police on city streets. Like, I think those all kind of I could see the court putting that in the box of, capacious executive power, end of story. This one's going to be hard, both because, as you say, everybody hates the tariffs, including the, big business world, the folks who really require, and I would say demand of the courts that we have an economy that is predictable, right? That you can make plans. And you're exactly right. The conversation with Rick Woldenberg that I had on Amicus last week. He's the CEO of Learning Resources, which is this family-owned business, one of the small businesses that are suing and winning. We'll see how they do at the court. One of the things he said, in addition to his sort of schoolhouse rock construction of like any little kid can tell you that the president doesn't set tariffs that is, exclusively reserved to the Congress. But the other thing he said, and it was really, I thought, moving and distressing, is that this falls heaviest on small businesses, right? That if you are a huge company, you can absorb the tariffs and eventually pass on the cost to consumers. You can't do that. You can't plan if you don't know what you're going to be paying next year. And it was interesting to hear him. He's also a lawyer. Interesting to hear him say that which should be obvious to anybody who wants stability in the economy, which is, you can't muddy the waters and have everybody just hope that because you're the president and you say you're getting good deals someday, that we all just live with it. The other thing that you're asking, and I think it's really important, is that, the president presumably has these powers under AIPA if there's an emergency, but there's no declared emergency. There's like a made up fentanyl crisis with Canada at the border. There is, if there's an emergency, there are emergency powers. So this is another one, right, to loop back to where we started, where there's kind of an emergency, but it's a fake emergency.
Yeah.
And how much is the court going to just credulously say, okay,
Right.
if he says that, everybody's screwing us on tariffs, then that must be an emergency. And the final thing, we flicked at it, but let's like land the plane, is this question of the major questions doctrine, right? Which was used to stymie President Biden's initiatives, right? Notably on loan forgiveness. But, every time the court was like, oh, you can't do that without express congressional permission,
Right.
that was a Biden thing. And so the court's now going to have to sit with the fact that was that only an operative principle
Yeah.
when Biden was the president? So I don't know how it's going to go. I know it's pinchy. Linda Greenhouse has a great sort of Schadenfreude piece about how much we're going to watch them sweat. But I do think, in some sense, if the sort of defining question of this conversation, Corey, has been like, what is going to be the big thing that the court says no on? I think there are reasons that this could be the big thing that the court says no on.
Yeah, at some point, it just becomes embarrassing for them when you have a statute that tries to rein in power and you're saying, no, it expands it. When you have a doctrine that you've announced not a very long time ago, this isn't Roe versus wait, this is the previous administration, the major questions doctrine that says if we're not explicitly and clear, if Congress is not explicit and clear in its delegation, then there isn't one. All of these things from their own jurisprudence, and then the way of textualism, the statute has restraints in it. It talks about unusual and extraordinary emergencies that are proceed from outside. None of those seem to hold here. So now the question is, are they so willing to disregard the law and their supposed own theories for pragmatism or for whatever their rationale is, to defer to the president and to not second guess him? I certainly hope not. And I think on this one, we'll see. It's a close question. The betting markets, I'm told, are split, but that the law might actually prevail here, in which case we can feel good about our legal education, although it might be getting in the way of some of the other analysis. I know that you have to go, and so I really want to thank you, Dahlia Lithwick, and to ask, do you have anything that you want to promote or say as a final goodbye to our listeners? It's really been a pleasure to have you on the Oath in the Office.
No, I think I have nothing that I want to promote. I want to remind people to donate to food banks, and I want to remind people to be kind, because there is a dearth of grace in the world. But more than anything, Corey, I am saying over and over to my listeners, and I really want to make a pitch for the notion of the Constitution means what we think it means. We get to have opinions. And I always cite my friend Jay Willis at Bulls and Strikes, who says, don't wait for the oracles on high to tell you what you know to be true, which is just basic precepts of equality and dignity and, yes, birthright citizenship and AIPA, and that the law is the law. And I think we cede a lot of ground when we think like pop popcorn and hope for the best. The courts will tell us. I think we have to be a part of, and this includes bolstering district court judges who are not only being unbelievably brave in the face of, threats from Trump, but, threats of impeachment and doxings and threats to their families. And I think we have to really figure out how to stand up for, principles we know to be true, legal principles and constitutional principles, and to not think that this is something that is like out there in the sky. It's really, really like in our pockets, and we have to not cede that ground. So that's the only thing I want to say.
Oh, I love it, and it really shows how much your journalism for Slate and for Amicus, how much we're kindred spirits, because I think what we're both trying to do is to say, just because a president is trampling on the oath and the obligation to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution and the law, and just because the court is enabling it, and just because the Congress is going along with it, it doesn't mean that there aren't laws and that there isn't a Constitution, and it's up to all of us to reclaim it. So thanks so much, Dahlia Lithwick, one of my favorite legal journalists. I'm so proud to have gone to the same law school and to get the chance to talk to you again. And I know the listeners feel the same. Thank you, Dahlia Lithwick, for joining us on The Oath in the Office.
Thank you for all the work that you guys do on this show. I'm grateful for it, and it was a treat to be with you.
This has been The Oath in the Office podcast. Thank you to our guest, Dahlia Lithwick. Thanks to John, who had to jump off. And I just want to remind you to subscribe on Apple or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. You can also watch us on our new YouTube channel. And finally, we have a weekly newsletter on Substack, so check us out there. What an honor to do this every week, to be in conversation with John and all our wonderful guests. And thank you also for these continued 5-star reviews. It's really been a pleasure and an honor to do this show, and we'll see you next week.